am transmitting this from a shielded ore shaft 300 meters below the surface of Kepler 9, and I want you to understand something before I say anything else. I am not a soldier. My name is Dio Amara. I map rock formations for a living. I measure mineral density and send reports to people who care about profit margins and nothing else. I have never fired a weapon in my life. I am 31 years old, and I have spent the last 4 years on this tiny outpost cataloging silicon deposits in a dead asteroid belt at the edge of humanity's reach. I am telling you this because what I saw today will only make sense if you understand what I am not. The Vreth fleet dropped out of hyperspace at 0614 hours, station time. I was eating a bowl of oats at a table near the viewport. There were 6 of us in the common room. Petra Holt was reading something on her tablet. Owen Grant was arguing with the coffee dispenser. Nicole was laughing at him. 3 others whose names I am writing down so that I will never forget them. Ellis Ward, Conrad Baines, and a young lab assistant named Faye Doyle, who had only been on Kepler 9 for 11 days. She had shown me photographs of her dog the evening before, a large brown animal named Rhubarb. One moment the sky beyond the viewport was empty and quiet and full of distant stars. The next moment there were ships, not 1 or 2, dozens, dark shapes, angular and enormous, sliding into formation like teeth closing in a jaw. They moved with a precision that made my stomach drop, because that kind of precision only comes from practice. These were not explorers. These were not traders. You do not move like that unless you have done it before to someone else. The outpost commander, a man named Colonel Arthur Finch, was on the communications channel within 90 seconds. I heard his voice through the common room speakers, steady and controlled in a way that told me he was working very hard to sound that way. All personnel, this is Finch. We have unidentified vessels in Sector 9. I need everyone at their assigned emergency stations. Do not panic. Do not transmit anything on open channels. Move. Owen Grant stopped arguing with the coffee machine. The common room went completely silent. I remember looking at Faye Doyle and seeing her set down her cup very carefully, like she was afraid of making noise. Even though the ships outside were still millions of kilometers away, we went to our stations. Mine was a supply room near the lower access tunnels, which tells you everything about how useful they considered geologists in a crisis. I sat on a crate and listened to the command channel, and I waited. The Vreth transmission came 40 minutes later. It was broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, in 47 languages, and the translation was almost insultingly smooth. They had clearly prepared it well in advance. The message said that the Kepler 9 sector had been designated a transit corridor under the authority of the Vreth Expansion Directive. All human personnel were given 12 hours to evacuate. Any facilities remaining after that period would be removed. The word they used was not destroyed. It was removed as if we were furniture. As if this outpost and the 212 people inside it were objects to be cleared away, so that something more important could use the space. Colonel Finch sent an emergency signal to Earth and to the Galactic Council simultaneously. Then he got back on the channel and told us to begin loading the 2 evacuation shuttles. I want to be clear about the timeline, because it matters. The Council's acknowledgement of our distress signal came in at the 2-hour mark. It was polite. It expressed concern. It said that a formal inquiry would be submitted to the Vreth governing body, and that all parties were encouraged to seek a peaceful resolution. It said this in the same tone you would use when telling a child that you have heard their complaint and you are looking into it. At hour 4, the Council transmitted a second message. This one was addressed specifically to humanity's representative, Dr. Mara Osi, who was currently aboard the Council station, some 40 light minutes away. The message advised her that the Vreth had sovereign expansion rights under the Galactic Charter, and that while the timing was regrettable, human facilities in unclaimed sectors were not protected under the same provisions as established territories. It suggested that humanity consider voluntary relocation. I heard Arthur Finch read that message aloud. I heard the silence that followed it. At hour 7, with 1 shuttle loaded and the second halfway through boarding, the Vreth opened fire. There was no second warning. There was no countdown. There was a sound like every metal surface in the station vibrating at once. A deep resonant hum that I felt in my teeth and my chest and the palms of my hands, and then the upper level of the station simply ceased to exist. The explosion was not what I expected. I had imagined a fireball, something cinematic. What I heard instead was a sound like the world inhaling sharply and then going very still. I was thrown against the wall of the supply room. I hit something with my shoulder, and then I was on the floor, and the lights were red, and the emergency channel was full of voices that were cut off, one by one until there was only static. I do not know how long I lay on the floor. When I got up, the air in the corridor was thick with particulate, and the pressure seals had blown on the upper access shaft. I moved downward on instinct, following the emergency lighting strips that still flickered along the base of the walls. The ore shaft access hatch was 40 meters below the common room. I pulled it open and I went inside and I sealed it behind me and I sat in the dark, inside a mountain of rock and carbon, and I breathed. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the shaking in my hands to slow, long enough to understand what I had to do next. The shaft had an emergency relay buried in the wall, a small unit designed to transmit geological survey data through deep rock to the surface receiver. Its range was limited, its signal was narrow, but it was still active because it ran on its own independent power cell, and nobody had thought to include it in the Vreth's targeting data. I pulled up the relay interface. My hands were steadier than I thought they would be. I did not think about the common room, or Fay Doyle, or Owen Grant and his argument with the coffee machine. I did not let myself. There would be time for that later, or there would not, but either way it would not help me right now. I composed the message in 37 words. I gave my name. I gave the station designation. I gave the time of the strike and a brief damage assessment, based on what I had heard and felt. And then I wrote the 4 words that I knew, with absolute certainty, that someone back home needed to hear above everything else. They fired first, unprovoked. I sensed it. Then I sat in the dark and I waited. And I thought about 212 people. And I thought about a brown dog named Rhubarb. And I did not cry because there was nobody there to see me, and so there was no point in being brave about it. But I did not cry anyway. I think I was too far past fear by then. I had passed through fear and come out the other side into something quieter and much more focused. 3 hours and 14 minutes later, a signal came back down through the rock and reached me in that narrow shaft. It was encoded with a military cipher that I had not known I had clearance for, but apparently someone back home had decided that today was the day to share that information. I decrypted it. I read it twice. It was not a message of comfort. It was not a promise of rescue. It was a set of coordinates, a timestamp 72 hours in the future, and a sequence of numbers that I recognized only because I had spent 4 years on a geological survey outpost where we used similar format for targeting mineral extraction charges. It was a strike package. Someone on Earth had received my 37 words, and they had not called for a meeting. They had not submitted a formal inquiry. They had done the thing that every civilized voice in the galaxy had spent 300 years assuming humanity would never, could never, would not dare to do. They had started planning. I pressed my back against the cold rock wall of that shaft, and I exhaled slowly. Outside, somewhere above me, the Vreth were moving through the wreckage of Kepler 9. They were probably already filing reports, cataloging the cleared space, notating the sector as open for transit use. They were probably doing it with the same calm efficiency with which they had arrived, because from their perspective, the matter was settled. A small obstacle had been removed. A Category 3 species had been reminded of its place. They did not know about my 37 words. They did not know about the signal that had come back to me through 300 meters of rock. They did not know that somewhere in the narrow darkness of a mining shaft, the last person alive on Kepler 9 was reading a strike package and already beginning to understand what came next. I closed the relay interface. I saved the coordinates. I checked the power cell on my emergency suit, because if anyone was coming for me in 72 hours, I needed to still be breathing when they arrived. I settled in to wait, and for the first time since the station went silent, something that was not grief moved through me. Something older and quieter and considerably more patient than anything the Vreth had put in their calculations. They had fired first. They had fired first, and they had not finished the job. In all the history of every species that humanity had ever studied, across every conflict and every record in every archive we had ever accessed, that was the single most consistent mistake a stronger force could make against a human one. You do not strike us and walk away. You do not take something from us and then turn your back. We remember every name. We count every loss. And we work quietly and without announcement, for exactly as long as it takes. The ore shaft hummed with the warmth of the relay unit's power cell. Outside was silence and wreckage, and the Vreth, already forgetting we were here. I had 72 hours. I started making notes. The Vreth Admiral's name, as I came to learn over the weeks that followed, was Vreth Kalen. In the official Galactic Council records, he was listed as a strategic expansion, Commander Class 1, with 43 successful territorial acquisitions across 6-star systems. His record was noted in the files as exemplary. The council members spoke of him the way you speak of a force of nature. with a kind of reluctant admiration that is really just another word for acceptance. In the briefing room aboard the extraction shuttle that pulled me out of the Kepler 9 shaft at hour 71, Lieutenant Colonel Grace Okafor spread his profile across the holographic table and looked at me with steady brown eyes and said, "Tell me exactly what you saw." I told her everything, every detail I had recorded in my notes, the formation the ships took when they dropped into the sector, the interval between the final transmission and the strike, the direction of the first impact based on the pressure differential I had felt in the walls. I am a geologist. I notice things about structure and force and the behavior of solid matter under stress. The Vreth had dropped a shaped charge on the station's upper superstructure, which told me the goal had been to disable communications first, and then collapse the pressurized living sections. It was efficient. It was practiced. They had done it before. Grace Okafor listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she nodded once and said, "Good, come with me." The extraction shuttle brought me to a vessel I had no name for. A long, dark ship with no registry markings and an internal layout that did not match any civilian or commercial design I had ever seen. I was given a meal, a change of clothes, and a medical scan, and then I was taken to a room where 5 people sat around a table and looked at me as though I was something they had been waiting for. One of those people was Dr. Mara Osi. I recognized her from the news feeds. In person, she was smaller than she appeared on screen, but somehow more present. The way certain people fill a room not with volume, but with the quality of their attention. She looked at me for a moment before she spoke, and I had the distinct sense that she was deciding how much of the truth I could handle. She apparently decided on all of it. "The Council has formally requested that Earth submit to a temporary withdrawal from all outer ring sectors, pending review of the Vreth expansion petition," she said. "They have framed this as a humanitarian measure to prevent further incidents." "Meaning they want us to leave," I said. "Meaning they expect us to leave," she said. "There is a difference." She slid a file across the table to me. I opened it. Inside was a document, dense with legal language, that the Council had drafted within 18 hours of the Kepler 9 strike. It was a formal recognition of the Vreth's territorial claim. It referred to the attack on the outpost as an enforcement action. It referred to the 212 people who died as collateral casualties of an administrative oversight. Administrative oversight. Those words sat in the room with all of us, and nobody spoke for a moment. Then a man at the far end of the table, who had not introduced himself and whose uniform had no insignia, said, "They wrote that before the bodies were cold." "They wrote that," Dr. Osai said carefully, "because they believed it was already over." I looked at the file. I thought about the strike package I had received in that shaft. I looked up. "Is it?" I asked. Dr. Osai smiled. It was a small, quiet thing, but it reached her eyes. "No," she said, "it is not." What followed was the most astonishing 2 hours of my life up to that point. And my life had just included surviving an orbital strike from inside a hole in a rock, so the bar was already considerably high. They showed me what humanity had been building, not what the public knew about, not the small fleet of diplomatic escort vessels, and the scientific research ships, and the handful of defensive satellites around Earth and Mars that, the Galactic Council had been told, represented the full extent of humanity's military capability. Not those. The other thing. The thing that had been constructed piece by piece over 60 years of quiet, patient, extraordinarily careful work, while humanity smiled politely at the Council, and attended the required treaties, and filed the required reports, and did everything that a cooperative, Category 3 species was supposed to do. 60 years ago, a woman named Dr. Claire Bennett had written a paper that was largely ignored by the galactic community, because it came from a primitive species, and was therefore not subject to serious consideration. The paper was about what she called adaptive conflict doctrine, which is a complicated way of saying that, if you are smaller than your enemy, you do not fight the way they fight. You fight the way they do not expect. Dr. Bennett had died 40 years ago, but her ideas had not. The fleet I was shown in those 2 hours was not large by galactic standards. It was never going to win a direct confrontation against the Vreth in open space. The Vreth had better shields. Their weapons had longer range. Their ships were faster in a straight line, and their armor was thicker, and their targeting systems were more sophisticated. Every single conventional metric said that humanity could not win a war against the Vreth Empire. The man with no insignia pulled up the tactical display and pointed to small markers spread across a wide region of space. "We are not going to fight them the way they fight," he said. "We are going to fight them the way nobody fights." The display shifted. It showed attack vectors, timing sequences, and something that I did not initially recognize until he explained it. Every major galactic power had deposited their complete military history in the Galactic Archive as part of a peace and transparency initiative that had been signed 40 years ago. The idea was that if everyone could see how every conflict had ever been fought, it would discourage aggression. What nobody had considered was that a Category 3 species with access to an academic exchange program would spend 30 years quietly reading every single file in that archive, every battle, every failed strategy, every approach that had been tried and had not worked, every weakness that had ever been exposed, every pattern that repeated across species after conflict after conflict. We had read all of it, we had studied it, we had built models from it, and we had used all of that accumulated knowledge to design a method of engagement that had never appeared in the archive, because we had invented it ourselves, from the gaps in everything else. The Vreth have 43 successful acquisitions, the man said. In every single one, the target species either surrendered immediately or attempted a conventional military response that the Vreth outmatched within 70 hours. Not once in 43 acquisitions has any species done what we are going to do. Witches, I said. Make it expensive, Grace Okafor said. Make it take a long time. Make it embarrassing. Make it cost them more than it's worth, and make sure the galaxy is watching every moment of it. The plan had a name, Operation Boomerang. It was not a complex name, but it was an honest one. The core of it was 70 autonomous drone clusters, each one small enough to evade standard Vreth long-range detection. Each one loaded with a targeting suite built from 3 decades of archived, galactic tactical data. They moved in patterns that no Vreth defensive algorithm had ever been trained on, because those patterns did not come from any known military tradition. They came from human history, from ancient asymmetric warfare, from guerrilla tactics developed on Earth over thousands of years of humans, fighting humans in conditions where one side always had less. The first cluster deployed 4 days after Kepler 9. I was not on the bridge when it happened. I was in a narrow observation room with a direct feed to the tactical display, sitting beside Grace Okafor with a cup of coffee that I had not yet touched. We watched the markers move. We watched the Vreth formation hold its position at the edge of the sector, slow and confident and enormous. We watched the drone cluster approach on a vector that the Vreth sensors would not flag as a threat for another 11 seconds. At second 8, Grace said quietly, "Here we go." The Vreth destroyer on the eastern flank went dark in 6 seconds, not explosively. Its power signature simply dropped off the display as if someone had turned off a switch. The drone cluster had targeted its power relay junctions, with a precision that the Vreth commander would later describe, in a message intercepted by our signals team, as geometrically impossible. The drone cluster scattered before the Vreth response could organize. 70 small signatures, moving in 70 different directions, each one following a pre-calculated path that looked random but was not, that exploited the natural debris field of the asteroid belt in ways that the Vreth had never bothered to model because they had never needed to. The Vreth fired at empty space for 40 minutes. They hit 3 asteroids. They hit none of our drones. Vreth Kalen's transmission to the Galactic Council arrived 6 hours later. It was the first time I heard his voice. It was deep and smooth and entirely certain of itself, even as the words it was saying were the beginning of something he had not expected to say. He reported that the human forces had used an unconventional engagement method, and that his fleet was assessing the situation. He described the destruction of the destroyer in precise clinical language. He did not use the word surprised, but he did use the phrase currently unclassified tactical approach, which in Vreth military language, our translator told me, is the closest they have to saying that something confused them. I looked at the tactical display. The destroyed destroyer was still dark on the readout, 1 down. "How many more have we got?" I asked. Grace Okafor looked at me. She had a small, focused expression that I would come to recognize over the next weeks as the face she made when she was recalculating. "Enough," she said. "As long as we are smart about it." I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. Vreth Kalen's message to the council had described the situation as contained. He had requested no additional support. He had stated, with the unshakable confidence of a commander who had run 43 successful acquisitions, that the matter would be resolved shortly. The council had believed him. Of course they had. They had watched us for 300 years. They had our files. They knew what Category 3 species did when confronted with a superior force. They surrendered. They petitioned. They accepted the terms that were offered, and they adapted to their new circumstances, and eventually the story moved on to the next page. Nobody in the council chamber had read Dr. Claire Bennett's paper. Nobody had thought to. It came from a primitive species. It was therefore not worth the time. We were counting on that. We had been counting on it for 60 years. I thought about the 212 people from Kepler 9. I thought about the names I had written down in that shaft, the ones I had been adding to since, the ones I would not let myself forget. The galaxy had called us primitives. The galaxy had told us to withdraw and file a petition, and accept a settlement that used the words administrative oversight for 212 lives. We had said we would take it under advisement. That was the last time anyone laughed at that phrase. 12 weeks into the conflict, I sat in a briefing room on a ship that still had no name and watched a newsfeed from the Galactic Council's public channel. The anchor, a tall violet-skinned Jareth with a voice like running water, was describing the human resistance as a notable anomaly. The word she used was interesting, not threatening, not impressive, interesting, the way you would describe an unusual weather pattern on a planet you were flying over. Behind her, on the graphic panel, was a map of the contested sectors. Human-held positions were marked in blue. Vreth-controlled space was marked in red. There was a great deal more red than blue. Grace Okafor turned off the feed. She looked at me and the 12 other people sitting around the table. Her face was the same as it always was, steady and forward-facing, but she looked tired in a way she had not looked 4 weeks ago. "They took the Mars garrison this morning," she said. Nobody spoke. "Admiral Chen's ship went down at 0340. We recovered 2 escape pods. We are still looking for the others." Admiral Henry Chen, I had met him once. He had large hands and a quiet laugh, and he had been the architect of the drone cluster strategy that had taken out Vreth Kalen's destroyer in the first week. He had spent 40 years in the Navy, and 6 of those years building the thing that no one in the galaxy thought we were building. I put my hands flat on the table. I breathed. "There is more," Grace said. "The bombardment of the northern African settlements is confirmed. We have 40,000 civilian casualties. The Vreth targeted the Sahara corridor at 0200 local time. They gave no warning. The room did not react the way rooms in films react to that kind of news. Nobody shouted. Nobody broke down. People went very still in the particular way that happens when something is too large to process quickly, and the mind simply holds it at a distance for the moment and files it to be dealt with later. I thought about what 40,000 people looked like. I could not make it fit inside my head. I thought instead about 12 people, about the ore shaft on Kepler 9, and I held that smaller number because it was the one I could carry. Grace continued. "The Council has issued another statement. They're calling on Earth to accept an immediate ceasefire and enter formal negotiation under Council mediation. The terms they are proposing include a formal withdrawal from all Outer Ring sectors, recognition of Vreth territorial claims in the disputed zones, and the decommissioning of all military assets constructed outside the original, Council-approved defense framework." She paused. "In other words," said a man named Philip Drummond, who ran our signals intelligence division and who I had come to trust completely over the past 3 months, "they want us to disarm and go home." "Yes," Grace said. "And Vreth Kalen," I asked. "Vreth Kalen has endorsed the ceasefire proposal. His exact message to the Council described the conflict as more protracted than anticipated but manageable. He has requested no additional fleet support. He wants to end this quietly." Philip leaned back in his chair. "Because it's embarrassing. That is, the assessment of our intelligence team, yes," Grace said. "It was the thing we had counted on. The thing that had been built into the strategy from the beginning. The piece of the plan that Dr. Claire Bennett had written about 40 years ago in a paper that nobody had bothered to read because it came from a primitive species. The Vreth had 43 successful acquisitions. In every one, the conflict had been resolved in under 90 days. That was the Vreth pattern, the rhythm their high circle expected, the pace at which expansion was supposed to move. A prolonged engagement with a Category 3 species was not merely militarily inconvenient, it was politically humiliating. It called into question the premise on which the entire Vreth expansion program rested, which was that weaker species did not resist, that the strong did not need to struggle. Every day we continued fighting was a message to the galaxy. Every drone strike that landed, every sector we held, every week that passed without our surrender was a broadcast on every frequency. We are still here, and the galaxy was watching. I knew this because of what Philip had told me 2 days before this meeting, in a quiet corridor outside the signals room, with a look on his face that was very close to wonder. "I am getting transmissions," he had said, "from 3 species, nothing official, nothing from their governments. Personal transmissions, routed through civilian channels, in code that is not quite good enough to hide but is clearly intended to look like it is." "Who?" I had asked. "The Jareth, a collective called the Pale Drift. And the Ozolin, I had known the names, minor species. Small civilizations with no military power to speak of and no voice on the council that anyone paid serious attention to. Species who had spent their own histories being managed and categorized and told to file petitions. "What are they saying?" I had asked. Philip had paused for a moment. Then he had said, "They are sending us tactical data, Vreth formation patterns, supply line vulnerabilities, things they have observed over decades that they were never in a position to use themselves." I had understood then, not allies in the formal sense, not partners or treaty-bound supporters, just species who had been quiet for a very long time and who were, in their small and careful way, passing notes through the wall. Now, in the briefing room, I looked at Grace and thought about Parliament. There was a vote coming. There had been for 2 weeks, a grinding political reality that had been building while we fought and buried our losses, and kept going. A block of representatives had been calling for ceasefire negotiations. They had real arguments and real numbers and real grief behind them, because 40,000 people in the Sahara corridor was not a number that could be answered with strategy and patience alone. People wanted it to stop. The desire for the pain to end is not weakness. It is human. It is exactly what you would expect from people who are not soldiers and who never wanted to be. I had been asked to testify before the parliamentary committee, me specifically. Not a general, not Dr. Osi, me, a geologist from Kepler 9, who had sent 37 words through a rock and started something that was now 12 weeks old and cost far more than any of us had imagined when we looked at that strike package in the extraction shuttle. I sat in front of those representatives and they looked at me, and I felt the weight of what they needed very clearly. They needed the conflict to be over. They needed the hurting to stop, and I understood that. I understood it in my bones, but I also remembered something. I remembered the message that the council had sent to Dr. Osi in the first hours after Kepler 9, the one that called 212 people and administrative oversight. And I knew, with the clarity that comes only from sitting in the dark for 71 hours with nothing to do but think, that the terms being offered now were not peace. They were the same message, delivered more softly. They were the galaxy saying, "You are a Category 3 species, accept what you are." I told the committee about Kepler 9. I told them about the ore shaft and the relay unit and the 71 hours. I told them about Ellis Ward and Conrad Baines and Faye Doyle and her brown dog named Rhubarb. I told them every name, all 212 of them. I read them from the list I had been keeping since the first night, because I had promised myself in that shaft that I would not let those names become statistics. When I finished, the room was very quiet. The ceasefire vote failed by 1 seat. That was the same night Philip came to find me in the corridor outside the signals room with something else on. His face entirely. "Is a transmission," he said, "from a Vreth logistics officer, low caste, routing through civilian channels. She wants to speak to someone with authority." "Why?" I said. "She says Vreth Kalen is under pressure from his high circle. She says they have given him a deadline. He has to show significant territorial gains within 60 days, or the high circle will reassign the campaign to a different commander, which is apparently a very significant humiliation in Vreth culture." I looked at Philip for a long moment. "She is offering information," he said, "in exchange for protection." "Does she want money?" I asked. "She wants," Philip said, and paused slightly, as though he was still adjusting to the idea, "a place to live where nobody will come and remove her." I closed my eyes for 2 seconds. I thought about the ceasefire vote, 1 seat, and the 40,000 in the Sahara corridor, and the 212 on Kepler 9 and the 60 days, that Vreth Kalen had to make his move. Then I opened my eyes and said, "Set up a channel, I will talk to her." The Vreth defector's name was Zell. She was a supply coordinator in the Vreth Logistics Division, which meant she knew exactly where every fleet asset was, how much fuel each vessel carried, how long the supply lines were, and precisely where they were thin. She also knew, because she had been assigned to the Campaign Records Division for 6 months before the Kepler 9 operation, what Vreth Kalen had planned and what he had not. She was calm on the channel. Her voice was different from what I expected, not harsh or aggressive, but measured with a slightly formal quality. She had clearly prepared what she wanted to say. "I am not doing this because I like humans," she said, through the translator. "I am doing this because I have seen what the High Circle does to officers who return without a completed acquisition, and I have seen what they do to the logistics staff who served those officers. I am doing this because I want to be somewhere else when that happens." "Fair enough," I said. She sent us 11 files, supply routes, fleet positions, the exact timing of Vreth Kalen's planned next strike, which was targeted not at a military asset, but at the water reclamation infrastructure in the European settlements, designed to create a humanitarian crisis severe enough to force Parliament to the table. Philip's face when he opened those files was the closest to alarm I had ever seen him come. Then he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I thought about 60 days, and Vreth Kalen's deadline, and a piece of an idea that had been growing quietly in the back of my mind since the very first briefing on this ship, the one where Grace Okafor had said make it expensive and make it take a long time. What if, I said slowly, we gave Vreth Kalen what he wants? Philip raised an eyebrow. Not actually, I said. Not really. We write a document, a formal ceasefire proposal, submitted through an unofficial channel, enough to look real to someone who wants to believe it is. We give him something he can show his high circle, something that buys him a few weeks of breathing room, something that makes him stop, while we, Philip said, use those weeks to do what exactly? I had been thinking about Project Longbow for 6 days. I had been talking to the engineering teams in the lower decks. I had been reading supply projections and studying formation maps and looking at the tactical data the Jareth and the Ozolin and the Pale Drift had passed us through civilian channels. And I had been building something in my head that I was not yet sure was possible. While we finish what we started, I said. Philip looked at me for a long time. You want to write a false surrender document, he said. Not false, I said. Preliminary, conditional. Something with enough legal language in it that Vreth Kalen can take it to his high circle and say the humans are considering terms. And Zell delivers it. She is already on our side. She has the access to route it through channels that Vreth Kalen will consider credible. Philip exhaled very slowly. Then he said, if he discovers it is false before we are ready, we lose everything we have bought. I know, I said. It has to be the most convincing document anyone has ever written. I know that too. He looked at the file Zell had sent. He looked at me. He nodded once. Then we had better start writing, he said. The document took us 4 days. Zell corrected 6 things about the phrasing that would have immediately flagged it to Vreth legal analysts. She had a precise, unsentimental eye for what read is genuine and what read is constructed, and she told me exactly which words Vreth Command would want to see, and which ones would make them look more closely. I sent it on a Thursday morning. I sat by the relay and waited for confirmation that it had been received. The confirmation came 6 hours later. Vreth Kalen had acknowledged the document. His response to his high circle, intercepted by Philip's team within the hour, described the situation as progressing toward a satisfactory resolution. He stood down the strike on the European water infrastructure. We had 90 days. I walked to the small porthole at the end of the signals corridor and looked out at the dark. I thought about Conrad Baines and Ellis Ward and Faye Doyle and everyone else from Kepler 9, and I thought about 40,000 people in the Sahara corridor who were now alive because Vreth Kalen believed a document that Zell and Philip and I had written at a table on a ship with no name, and I thought about the 90 days ahead and everything that had to happen inside them. Get some sleep, Philip said, appearing at my elbow. I will, I said, in a while. I stood at that porthole for a long time. The stars outside did not move, but everything else, quietly and without announcement, had already begun. In those 90 days, humanity did not sleep. I say that not as a figure of speech, but as a literal description of what I observed on that nameless ship and in the communications I received from the engineering facilities and the shipyards and the remote construction platforms that had been running quietly in the dark for 60 years, while the galaxy watched something else. People worked in shifts of 6 hours, the minimum that medical staff would allow, and they worked with a focused, unhurried precision that I had never seen before and have not stopped thinking about since. Not frantic, not desperate, deliberate, as though every person involved had already grieved what they needed to grieve and had now arrived at the other side of it, at the place where grief becomes something you carry in your left hand while your right hand stays busy. I was not an engineer. I was not a weapons designer or a tactical analyst or a military strategist. I was a geologist who had survived an ore shaft and read 37 words into a relay unit and somehow ended up at the center of something I could not fully see the edges of. But Grace Okafor kept asking me to the briefings, and I kept attending them, and I started to understand why she wanted me there. She wanted me there because I remembered the names, not metaphorically, literally. Every briefing at some point would arrive at a moment where the numbers on the display were very large and very abstract, where the losses were projected as percentages, and the victories were described in sector hold ratios, and the whole shape of the war became something geometric and removed from the specific weight of actual human beings. And Grace would look at me, And I would say something about Kepler 9 or the Sahara Corridor or the Mars Garrison, about a specific person, a specific day, and the room would settle again into something real. She told me once, late at night in the corridor outside the operations center, that the hardest thing about commanding a war was keeping it from becoming a problem to be solved. The moment it becomes only a problem, she said, you start making the same mistakes the Vreth make. You stop seeing the people. You start counting the space. I thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed. Project Longbow was the name Grace used in the briefings. The man with no insignia, whose name I eventually learned was Colonel Reed Hartley, used other words. He called it the long answer. He had spent 20 years building it in the margins of the approved defense budget. Inside programs listed as research development and materials testing and geological survey support, which made me feel a faint retrospective kinship with him. The core of Project Longbow was 800 vessels, not warships in the traditional sense, mining haulers, cargo transports, industrial platforms, civilian craft that had been quietly refitted over periods of 5 to 15 years with mass driver arrays, navigation packages adapted from archived galactic designs, and targeting systems that ran on a distributed artificial intelligence network that humanity had been developing also quietly, also for decades, under the description of logistics optimization software. Individually, none of those ships would last long against a Vreth line destroyer. The Vreth had thicker armor. They had better point defense systems. They had guns with a longer range and a higher yield. But 800 ships do not need to be individually superior. They need to be coordinated. They need to move as one organism, each one sharing sensor data with every other, each one adjusting its position in real time, based on a picture of the battlefield that no single ship could see alone, but that all of them together could see completely. The man who had designed that coordination system was a quiet software engineer named Oliver Price, who was 34 years old and had never served in the military, and who told me when I met him in the lower deck engineering bay that he had spent 12 years writing targeting algorithms for geological survey drones. I stared at him. Small vehicles, he said, with a shrug that was either humble or amused. I could not tell which. Moving through irregular terrain. Coordinating without direct communication because the rock blocks the signal. You learn to make them think as a group. You built a battle AI from survey drones, I said. I built a very precise group navigation system, he said. What it navigates is not my department. I liked Oliver Price considerably. The Jareth data had given us something that changed the arithmetic of the engagement. In 12 of the 43 Vreth acquisitions, the target species had attempted a conventional fleet engagement. In every one, the Vreth had won by pulling their ships into a tight defensive formation and using their superior range to destroy incoming vessels before they could close to effective firing distance. The formation was called, in the Vreth tactical records, the Iron Collar. The Iron Collar worked against everything it had ever been used against, because everything it had ever been used against had approached in the conventional way, from predictable vectors, in groups that the Vreth's targeting systems had been designed to track and counter. Oliver's distributed AI did not approach conventionally. It did not approach at all, in the classical sense of a fleet moving toward an enemy. It enveloped 800 ships, each one small, each one moving on a vector that was individually non-threatening, forming a sphere around the Vreth formation from distances that the Vreth point defense network was not calibrated to cover simultaneously. The math was the thing. Philip had shown it to me on a late night when neither of us could sleep, drawn on a tablet with a stylus. Simple geometric shapes that explained something that felt almost too clean to be real. The Iron Collar could cover every conventional approach vector with overlapping fields of fire. It could not cover every point on a sphere simultaneously. Not with the weapon systems the Vreth used. The angles did not work. We are going to fight them with geometry, Philip had said. We are going to fit them with patience, I had said. The geometry is just the tool. The 90 days ended on a Tuesday. The false ceasefire document had given Vreth Kalen enough political cover with his high circle to stop the immediate pressure. Zell had been extracted to a secure location on a station that does not appear on any public registry. She had asked for a room with a window. We had given her one. She spent a great deal of time looking at stars, which I found, given everything, entirely understandable. At 0400 on that Tuesday morning, Operation Longbow launched. I was in the Joint Command Center, a larger room than any I had been in on this journey, aboard a vessel that had a name. It was called the Meridian, and it was the closest thing we had to a flagship, though Grace would have rejected that word. She called it the coordination platform, which was accurate and also considerably less dramatic. which was very much her style. The tactical display showed 800 blue markers spreading from their launch positions at the edge of the Kuiper belt. The Vreth fleet was positioned in Sector 9, near the coordinates where Kepler 9 had once orbited. They had been stationary for 11 days, waiting for the ceasefire negotiations that Vreth Kalen believed were about to begin. They were large and confident, and entirely still. Oliver Price was standing to my left with a tablet and an expression of extreme focus. Grace Okafor was at the main console. Reed Hartley stood with his arms at his sides and watched the display without speaking, as he always did. Philip sat next to me. He had brought 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one without being asked. At 0412, the first wave reached engagement distance. I will not pretend that what happened next was clean or simple or without cost. It was not. We lost 61 ships in the first 9 minutes. 61 crews that had trained for this for years, and who had known when they launched that the opening minutes would be the most dangerous, and had climbed aboard anyway. Every one of those 61 ships had launched knowing exactly what was asked of them, and had launched anyway, because that is what you do when the alternative is the thing that happened on Kepler 9 and the Sahara Corridor and the Mars Garrison. I held their loss in my left hand and kept my right hand steady. The iron collar began to fracture at minute 11. Oliver's AI had found the angles, the precise vectors through which the Vreth Point Defense Network could not cover every incoming track simultaneously, and it was using them with a cold mathematical thoroughness that left no room for the Vreth to adapt in real time. Their formation began to shift, pulling inward to reinforce the gaps, which was the correct response and also exactly what we had anticipated, because pulling inward shortened their effective range and allowed the outer ring of our sphere to close. At minute 14, Vreth Kalen's flagship lost its main propulsion array. It did not explode. It drifted. It was still intact, still fighting, but it could not maneuver, and a ship that cannot maneuver in that formations was a fixed point that Oliver's AI could give its full attention. At minute 19, the flagship's weapon systems went dark. Grace Okafor said very quietly, "Hail them." The channel opened. The translator filled the room with the sound of Vreth command language, fast and clipped. Then Vreth Kalen's voice for the second time filled the room. This time it was different from the smooth certainty I had heard in his first transmission to the council. This time it was the voice of a man recalculating very quickly and finding that nothing added up. He said, "Request terms." Grace looked at me. I am not sure why she looked at me. Perhaps because I was the one with the list of names. Perhaps because I had been in the room for every decision and she wanted me to know that this one was also real. I looked at the display. I thought about 11 weeks and 90 days, and 60 years and 212 people and 40,000 more, and a brown dog named Rhubarb. "Ceasefire," Grace said into the channel. "Pending formal negotiation. Your fleet stands down. Your vessels remain where they are. Nothing more for now." Vreth Kalen's response came in 3 seconds. Agreed. The room did not erupt. Nobody shouted or embraced. People exhaled. One person in the back of the room put her face in her hands for a moment and then raised her head again. Philip set down his coffee cup very carefully, the same way Faye Doyle had set down hers in the common room on Kepler 9, before the world changed. I looked at the tactical display. The Vreth formation was standing still. Our 800 ships held their positions, patient and geometric and exactly where they were supposed to be. Outside the viewport at the far end of the room, the stars were the same as they always were, distant and permanent and entirely indifferent to what had just happened. But something had changed among them. Something that would take time to understand fully, something that had been building for 60 years and 12 weeks and 90 days and one long Tuesday morning, and it was not finished yet. It was, in fact, only beginning. I stood in the Galactic Council chamber for the second time in my life on a morning in early spring, Earth calendar, and the thing I noticed first was the quiet. Not ordinary quiet, not the quiet of a room between conversations. It was the specific quiet that fills a space when people who are accustomed to being comfortable suddenly find that they are not, and they are trying very hard not to show it. I have learned to recognize that quality of silence over the past year. It has a texture. You can feel it against your skin when you walk into a room. I walked to the human delegation's designated area, and I sat down and I placed my hands flat on the surface in front of me and I looked around the chamber. The chamber was vast. It seated representatives of over 300 registered species, arranged in concentric tiers that curved upward toward a transparent ceiling, through which you could see the stars. The design was meant to be impressive. It succeeded. The first time I had come here, As an observer attached to Dr. Osi's diplomatic mission before Kepler 9, I felt very small in that room. I did not feel small now. Dr. Mara Osi sat to my left. She was wearing the same kind of quiet, well-cut clothing she always wore, and she had the same expression she always had, attentive and contained, giving nothing away before the moment came to give it. Reed Hartley sat to my right. Philip Drummond was in the observer gallery above, with Grace Okafor and Oliver Price and Zell, who had asked to be present and whom we had cleared after a considerable amount of discussion. Vrethkallen was brought in through a side entrance. He was larger in person than I had imagined. The Vreth are imposing physically, broad-shouldered and dark-scaled, with a stillness to their movement that speaks of a species that has been at the top of its particular hierarchy for a very long time. He was in formal attire, which among the Vreth involves a great many angular details that I am told convey rank and history. He looked at the chamber. He looked at the human delegation, and then he looked at me. His eyes held on me for a moment, dark and measuring, and I thought, genuinely puzzled. I am, by any conventional standard, not a very imposing figure. I am a medium-height geologist from Lagos with a preference for practical clothing, and a long history of being the least important person in most rooms. I am not someone that a decorated expansion commander would typically look, with that particular expression, but he had been given a briefing. He knew who I was. He knew about Kepler 9 and the ore shaft and the 37 words and the false ceasefire document and all the rest of it. He had read the file. And now he was looking at me with the expression of someone who had prepared very carefully for a situation, and then discovered that reality was shaped differently from the preparation. I held his gaze. I did not look away. After a moment he did. The council session was called to order by the presiding administrator, a tall Ozolin with translucent features, and a voice that carried effortlessly through the chamber without any apparent effort. The formal agenda was read. The ceasefire status of the human Vreth engagement was confirmed as holding. The purpose of the session was described as the review and determination of post-conflict territorial and diplomatic arrangements. Dr. Osi spoke first for the human delegation. She was precise and unhurried, and she used exactly the number of words that were needed and no more, which is a skill I have come to consider one of the most underrated forms of intelligence. She outlined the human position. The attack on Kepler 9 had been an unprovoked act against a legal settlement in unclaimed space. The subsequent engagement had been a defensive response to that attack. Humanity was not seeking punitive reparations or territorial expansion. Humanity was seeking three things. The first was formal reclassification of humanity from Category 3 to Category 1 status in the Galactic Registry, reflecting the demonstrated capacity and independent development that the preceding conflict had made undeniable. The second was a permanent seat on the Galactic Security Council, with full voting rights and equal standing to all existing member species. The third was the ratification of what Dr. Osi called the Human Accord, a formal protection clause that established the principle that any direct military action against human settlements or human civilians would constitute a triggering event under which humanity reserved the right to respond with full military force, immediately, proportionately, and without requiring prior council approval. She read all 3 points in the same tone. She did not emphasize any of them over the others. She did not raise her voice or lower it. She simply stated them as facts that had already been decided and were being shared as a courtesy. The chamber was very quiet when she finished. Then the Vreth High Circle representative, a thin-voiced functionary whose name I did not catch, began to speak. He raised objections. He used the language of the Galactic Charter, citing provisions and subsections and established precedents. He was good at it. He had clearly been doing it for a long time, navigating these sessions with a practiced fluency that was designed to create the impression of engagement while moving nothing forward. He spoke for 11 minutes. When he finished, Dr. Osi said, "The Council will note that the events of the past year constitute sufficient demonstration that existing charter provisions did not adequately protect registered species from military aggression. The Human Accord addresses that gap." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "We are not asking the Council to decide whether these protections are appropriate," she said. "We are informing the Council of the protections we have decided are appropriate for ourselves. The vote before this chamber is on the question of formal recognition. We recommend a yes vote." The first speaker to rise in support was the Jareth ambassador. She was small and violet-skinned, and she had a voice like running water, and I recognized her as the anchor from the newsfeed that Grace had turned off 12 weeks into the conflict, the one who had called us an interesting anomaly. She stood and said that the Jareth delegation would vote in favor of all three of humanity's proposed conditions, and she said it without elaboration, which was in the council's culture, about as emphatic as a statement could be. The Ozalan delegation voted yes next. Then the Pale Drift Collective, through their designated voice, and then species I did not know, one after another, rising to indicate their support. Not all of them, not every voice in the chamber, but enough. More than enough. I watched it happen. I sat with my hands flat on the table and I watched 60 years of quiet, patient, unhurried work produce a result in a chamber full of stars. And I thought about all the things that had led here. All the decisions, and all the losses, and all the nights that had not allowed sleep, and all the names on my list. When Vreth Kalen was given the floor, he was brief. He stated that the Vreth Empire accepted the ceasefire terms. He stated that the Vreth Empire did not contest the reclassification. His voice was still deep and smooth, but the certainty had a different quality to it now. It was not the certainty of someone who has never been surprised. It was the certainty of someone who has been surprised and has decided how to carry that. He looked at me once more before he sat down. I thought about what he had said to Dr. Osi when they had met privately the previous evening, in a small anteroom off the main corridor. I had been present at that meeting, also at Dr. Osi's request. He had looked at me and spoken in Vreth, and the translator had rendered it as a single word, how? And I had said what I told you I said. I had told him about 10,000 years of human history. I had told him about our particular long tradition of fighting each other across continents and centuries, of developing every possible method of conflict, of learning from every loss and improving and returning. I had told him that when the Vreth arrived, they had not encountered a species that did not know how to fight. They had encountered a species that had been practicing for an extremely long time, and had simply not had an external opponent before. He had listened without expression. When I finished, he had said one more thing, and the translator had taken a moment with it, because the Vreth word was evidently a complicated one to render in human language. What came out was, unfortunate. I had thought about that word for a long time afterward. Unfortunate, not wrong, not regrettable. Unfortunate, the way a person describes stepping into rain they did not know was coming. A practical observation about a situation that turned out to be other than expected. I thought it might be the most honest thing he had said to any of us. The vote concluded. The administrator announced the result. The human accord passed, the reclassification was approved, the Security Council seat was granted, the votes were recorded, the session was adjourned. People moved around me, rising, gathering their things, beginning the conversations that follow formal proceedings. The enormous chamber filled with the sound of 300 species in quiet motion. I stayed in my seat for a moment. I put my hands in my lap. Philip appeared at my shoulder. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, which was the right thing to do. After a while, I stood up. We walked out of the chamber together, through a corridor I had not taken before, and at the end of it was a long viewport, one of the wide observation panels that looked out directly into space. No artificial lighting between you and the dark, just the transparent material and everything beyond it. I stopped at the viewport and looked out. The stars were the same. They are always the same. They do not rearrange themselves to mark occasions. They do not pause for the things that happen between them. They simply continue to exist with the same ancient, unconcerned permanence they have always had. I thought about Kepler 9. I thought about what it had looked like from the common room viewport on that ordinary morning before the sky filled with ships. I thought about the coffee that had been brewing, and the tablet that Petra Holt had been reading, and Owen Grant's argument with the coffee dispenser, and the photographs of a large brown dog on a tablet screen. I started saying the names, not out loud, but in the order I had written them, the way I had done in the ore shaft that first night and every night since. Ellis Ward, Conrad Baines, Faye Doyle, Petra Holt, Owen Grant, Nina Cole, and all the rest, one by one, the 212 names that the council had called an administrative oversight, and that I had been keeping in a list for over a year. I said them all. Philip stood beside me and did not move until I was finished. When I was done, I looked out at the stars for another moment. I thought about what Grace Okafor had said to me, that the hardest thing was keeping the war from becoming a problem to be solved. I thought about 60 years of quiet work and 90 days of a lie carefully written, and 11 weeks of something that the galaxy had decided was over before it started. I thought about the category they had put us in, primitive. 3. Something to be managed and noted and occasionally acknowledged and never, under any circumstances, taken seriously until circumstances made it unavoidable. I thought about what that category said about the people who designed it, that they believed the strongest thing in a room was always the one with the largest weapon. That they had encountered so many species that had bent or broken under pressure that they had stopped imagining the ones that did not. We had not broken. We had not bent. We had done the thing that apparently no one in the recorded history of the galaxy had thought to model for. We had gotten angry quietly, and we had worked, and we had waited, and we had come back, not for glory, not for empire, not because we wanted the fear of the galaxy. We wanted something considerably simpler and considerably harder to take away. We wanted to be looked at as real. We wanted the 212 people on Kepler 9 to have mattered. We wanted the 40,000 in the Sahara corridor to have mattered. We wanted every person who had spent 60 years building something in the dark, on ships with no names, in programs listed as geological survey support, to have mattered. We wanted our losses to mean something. We wanted our endurance to be seen. The galaxy had not expected us to retaliate. Every model they had for a species like ours predicted surrender or collapse. The files said so. The archives said so. 43 acquisitions said so. What the files did not say, what the archives had not recorded, what 43 acquisitions had never taught them, was what happens when you take something from a species that remembers. When you strike first and do not finish. When you turn your back and assume the matter is resolved. We had told them now. I put my hand on the viewport glass. The surface was cool. Outside, the stars continued their ancient, indifferent burning. Around them, at distances I could not perceive from here, humans and ships held their positions with the patience of something that has learned to wait. Not because we are naturally patient. We are not. We are a species of extraordinary impatience and tremendous restlessness and a profound inability to leave things alone. But we are also the species that sat in an ore shaft for 71 hours and sent 37 words through 300 meters of rock. We are the species that read 60 years of archives and found the gaps. We are the species that wrote a false document at a table on a ship with no name and bought 90 days from it. We are the species that remembered every name. The galaxy had learned something today. Not about our weapons or our ships or our distributed AI network or our targeting mathematics. They had learned those things over the past year. What they had learned today, in that chamber, in the vote and the silence and the expression on Vreth Kalen's face, was something older and more important. They had learned that we do not have an off switch. There is no point at which a human being looks at a loss and concludes that it was simply the cost of being what we are. There is no negotiated acceptance of a number, no administrative figure that settles the account. We count, we remember, we work, and we come back. I took my hand from the viewport. Philip looked at me. Ready? Yes, I said. We walked away from the stars and back toward the people who were waiting, and I carried the names with me the way I always do. In the left hand, quiet and specific and permanent, while the right hand stayed ready. The galaxy didn't expect us to retaliate. Now they know better. And I hope, with everything I have, that they never need to be reminded.